Hello and welcome to another Mr. Carter Science Special. If you're liking these videos, don't forget to like and subscribe and let me know what you're learning in the comments below. In this video we're going to be looking at two separate ideas. We're going to be looking at differing theories of evolution, comparing those of Lamarck, Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. And then we're going to look into the evidence leading to the acceptation of Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. So, evolution is the gradual change of one species into another over time. All the species that are alive today, and many more that are now extinct, evolved from simple life forms which first developed on planet Earth more than 3.5 billion years ago. So in the 18th century, the 1700s in Europe, most people believed that the world and life was made as described in the Bible's first chapter, Genesis, and that life started around 6,000 years ago. In fact, it began on October the 23rd, 4004 BC, according to Archbishop Ussher in the 1650s. Archbishop Ussher came to that conclusion after studying the lineages of the various different people in the Bible. However, by the 19th century, in the 1800s, evolution was becoming widely accepted among scientists due to an increasing amount of fossil evidence. However, the mechanism of how one species evolved into another was still unknown. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, a French biologist, came up with a theory to explain how evolution occurred. He suggested that the fountain of life links all organisms, and all organisms evolved from primitive worms. Lamarck thought that all organisms were linked through this fountain of life, and he suggested that individual animals adapt and evolve to suit their environments. He also said that all organisms are evolved from primitive worms, and Lamarck said that evolution from one species into another occurred due to the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Lamarck's mechanism of evolution came to be known as inheritance of acquired characteristics, whereby useful changes developed by the parents during their lives are passed on to their offspring. For example, the ancestors of giraffes. To survive, they must have had to stretch to reach their food. This will have made their necks a little bit longer. So the next generation will have had slightly longer necks because they will have inherited that characteristic from their parents, according to Lamarck. However, Lamarck's ideas were rejected because there was no evidence for the fountain of life. People did not like the idea of being descended from worms. And people could see that changes in their body over their lifetime were not passed on to children. For example, a scar or having big muscles would not be automatically passed on to children born to you, to your offspring. So when Charles Darwin came along with the idea of evolution by natural selection, his ideas were naturally viewed with skepticism, and it took some time to accept Darwin's ideas, and that's what we're going to look at now. So in 1831, Charles Darwin became a naturalist on the survey ship the HMS Beagle on its voyage to South America and the South Sea Islands. In South America, Darwin identified a new species of common rhea, which is an ostrich-like bird. And he noticed two similar species living in slightly different areas, and that started Darwin thinking. In the Galapagos Islands, he observed a large variety of species and noticed the differences between similar species on different islands. He found similarities between types of finches, iguanas and tortoises on different islands. However, each species was adapted to the local conditions. Darwin made lots of detailed sketches, written observation, and he collected a huge amount of animal and plant specimens. So when Darwin reached the Galapagos, which lie here about 1,000 miles away from the coast of Ecuador on the equator, one of the species that Darwin was interested in were the tortoises that lived on the islands. And he noticed that tortoises from wetter islands, which had more grass species growing, they had a lower rounded shell, a more rounded shell, and they only needed to reach downwards to eat their grass. However, tortoises from a drier island, he noticed, would have a much higher peak to their shell. And this was because they had to reach up to feed on vegetation growing much higher. As you can see here with this tortoise feeding from this cacti, it's having to reach its neck much higher. And its shell allows its neck to stretch and for it to reach higher up, compared to the tortoises that would only be eating grass on an island which received more rainfall and had more grass species growing. He also noticed the finches, and he saw that all the finches on the Galapagos Islands were similar in their body shape. However, each island had a different species adapted to the local environment and the different conditions on the island. And this was easy to see as all their beaks were different shapes. Some finch species had larger beaks adapted for cracking nuts, and other finch species had long, thin beaks adapted for extracting insects from holes in trees or holes in the ground. This adaptation to the environment was further evidence for Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. So let's have a quick reminder of what natural selection is. And Darwin noted the following points. He said that the environment is not stable. It can change both locally and globally. He said that in a particular population you will always find variation. Living things are not the same. Variation will occur as a result of meiosis and due to mutations in particular alleles. He also noticed that there was overproduction. More living young are born than will survive into adulthood. And this leads to competition. Organisms will compete for things like food, shelter, and mates. Particularly if the environment changes, there'll be an increase in competition. Advantages. Some organisms within a species will have characteristics that give them an advantage and help them to survive, and so therefore they're more likely to breed. And if you can survive and breed, then you will pass on your genes or your alleles for those successful characteristics onto your offspring. So more of the next generation will have that same useful feature. If the environment stays the same, even more of the next generation will have this useful feature, and so it will become more common in the following generations. And so we can have a slow, gradual change over time in the characteristics of a particular species. When Darwin returned from his voyage, he read the works of Lamarck, he read the works of Lyell and Malthus, and Darwin expected opposition to his ideas. So he took 20 years to complete his famous book, Origin of Species. He was building up evidence to support his theory on evolution. His evidence included the animals and plants he'd collected on the HMS Beagle, pigeon breeding experiments, which were in effect selective breeding, barnacle habitats and adaptations to different environments, and the fossil record. He eventually came up with the theory of evolution by natural selection. He finally published his ideas when he realised that his fellow naturalist Alfred Wallace was also developing similar ideas. And the year after he published his theory in his book The Origin of Species in 1859. So let's have a little think about some of the organisms that Darwin encountered in the Galapagos, and how that these species could perhaps have evolved from a common ancestor. Well, one of the things that Darwin noted was that some islands in the Galapagos chain have a lot of insects living in holes in trees or in holes in the ground. So he thought that a population of finches blown over to the Galapagos by strong winds, or perhaps floating over on rafts of vegetation, there would naturally be variation in that population of finches. Some of them would have thicker beaks and some of them would have thinner beaks. On the islands with lots of insects living in holes in trees, finches with the thinner beaks will have an advantage over the finches with thicker beaks. They can reach more insects, so they can eat more insects. The finches with thinner beaks are more likely to survive and breed and pass on those alleles for the thinner beaks to the next generation. Over time on that island, the alleles for the thinner beaks will become more and more common, so more finches will have thinner beaks, and this will lead to a slow, gradual change from the original beak shape of the original population of finches that were blown over to the Galapagos. However, some other islands on the Galapagos have very few insects living in holes in trees, but they do have a lot of very hard nuts. Now, that same population of finches who were blown over by the strong winds or the rafts of vegetation can also evolve by natural selection to be adapted to this new environment. Some of the finches will have thicker beaks and some will have thinner beaks, again showing that variation. And on the islands with a lot of hard nuts, the finches with the thicker beaks will have the advantage over the finches with the thinner beaks, because they can break open more nuts, so they can eat more nuts. So the finches with a thicker beak is more likely to survive, breed and pass on those alleles for thicker beaks to the next generation. So over time, the alleles for thicker beaks will become more common on that particular island with the hard nuts. So more and more of the finches will have thicker beaks. And you can see here on a famous diagram the variety of beak shapes that Darwin noted on the various different islands as those finches evolved by natural selection to become adapted to the new environments that they were encountering. You can see here, for example, a finch with a much thinner beak. Down here, a finch with a much larger beak, good for breaking the nuts or the seeds. Over here, we have finches adapted for eating buds and fruits, and so on. When The Origin of Species was published, it was a very popular but also very controversial book. Many people defended the ideas in the book passionately. Others were offended or even refused to accept the ideas. Darwin's ideas were only gradually accepted due to a variety of reasons, including the theory of natural selection, evolution by natural selection, challenged religious beliefs that God made all animals and plants that lived on Earth. Many scientists felt there was a lack of evidence. There was no way to explain how variety and inheritance happened. Genes and chromosomes were unknown at the time, and in 1859 when Darwin published his book. Darwin was not a well-known or a respected scientist. However, when Darwin died in 1882, his ideas were generally accepted and he was regarded as one of the great scientists of the world. So let's just have a little think about some of the scientists that we've mentioned in this video, and let's see if we can match their names to their discoveries. Well, we started off by talking about Mendel, who identified the units of inheritance. Then we thought about Watson and Crick, who identified the structure of DNA with the help of Rosalind Franklin. Then we went on to discuss Lamarck and his theory of evolution by the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Finally, moving on to look at Darwin and how his ideas of evolution by natural selection were eventually accepted by the scientific community due to overwhelming evidence. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, don't forget to like and subscribe, and let me know what you've learned from this video in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching.